Hi guys and welcome back. In this video we're going to learn about Lambda functions. A Lambda function is a different type of function which doesn't have a name and is only used to return values. Remember that we mentioned that functions can be used to perform actions such as printing something out or operating with values and returning them, such as the sum function, or they can do both. But Lambda functions are exclusively used to operate on inputs and return outputs. They are almost never used to perform actions. Let's start with a simple function that gets some inputs and returns some outputs. Let's go to our trusty add function that returns x plus y. If you print add of 5 and 7, you've got that add 5 and 7 is going to run this line here, add x and y together, which gives you 12, and then it's going to return it, replacing essentially this entire function call by the value 12, and then we're going to print that out. So if we press play on this, you get 12. You can rewrite this function as a lambda function, which would be like this: lambda x comma y, x plus y. So what we've got here, and ignore this underline for a second. What we've got here is the lambda keyword, then we've got a space, and then we've got the list of parameters, which in this case are x and y. Then we've got a colon, and then we've got the return value of the function, but we don't specify the return keyword. So lambda functions are used to return outputs. You don't need to specify return because that's what they're for, so Python will infer that. So this does exactly the same thing as the add function earlier, but it doesn't have a name. Notice that the add variable is never created. So to solve that problem, if you want your lambda functions to have a name, which sometimes you won't, and I'll show you why not in a moment, you can just assign that to a variable. So here we've got the add variable, make it equal to our lambda function, and then you can call it in your program using add. So again, there are 4 parts to a lambda function. You've got the lambda keyword, then you've got your parameter list, then you've got your colon, and finally your return value without the return keyword. Lambdas are meant to be short functions, often used without giving them a name. For example, in conjunction with the built-in function called map. So we're going to learn about map in a moment. However, you can give them a name if you want. If you didn't want to give it a name, then you would have to use it in the same line where you define it. Otherwise, as soon as you define this function, you have no way of actually using it because it doesn't have a name, so it's kind of pointless to just define the lambda function without using it. If you wanted to use this lambda function, you need to surround it in brackets so that Python will treat this as a single unit, and then call the function here, say with the values 5 and 7, and this here means that you're using the 5 and 7 call on this thing, which is a lambda function, which essentially calls the function with the arguments 5 and 7. You can see why this is also not very often done, because it's extremely confusing, and this will still not do anything, because you still need your print function around it as well. So lambda functions used in this way, not very common at all. Usually you will define a proper function and use it like we did earlier on instead. But let's get into some uses for lambda functions that are actually useful. Let's say you've got a function called double that doubles a number passed into it, and then you've got a sequence of numbers such as 1, 3, 5, and 9. And you want to double this sequence, or you want to double each number in this sequence. Something that you may see is something like double equal, and then use a list comprehension, x times 2 for x in sequence. So x times 2 is the same as this function returns for its given inputs. So instead, we can do double x for x in sequence. The benefit of this is that using a function call allows you to potentially perform larger or more complicated mathematical expressions without making your list comprehension more complicated. At this specific point in time, it's not a big difference, but it can be in other scenarios. So instead of doing this list comprehension, you can use the map function, and that is where lambda functions become extremely useful. So instead of using that, you can do double equal map of double on sequence. And that does exactly the same as this list comprehension. What map does is it goes over each value in the sequence, such as a list, a tuple, a set, and so on, and it applies the double function on each element and then returns the final sequence out to you. So that's what map is for. It's very useful. So it is the counterpart for this list comprehension here. In Python, you would usually use list comprehensions, but many other programming languages don't have list comprehensions, so they have to use things like map. So if you are working with developers familiar with other programming languages and you want to use a programming style that they will be familiar with, you can use something like map. In addition, if you're working in a large project and you are using multiple different programming languages such as JavaScript as well as Python, you may want to use map so that your Python code and your JavaScript code both have similar style. With that said though, the list comprehension is usually slightly faster, so there is no reason to use things like map over list comprehensions most of the time in Python. Let's rewrite this example using a Lambda function. Your doubled list comprehension here could define a Lambda function here, Lambda x times 2, and then use x as the argument to that function, and then you no longer need this doubled there. But this is getting quite confusing because, as I mentioned earlier on, you have your Lambda function which must be surrounded by brackets, and then you have another pair of brackets to pass in the argument, so this is a little bit unreadable. So if you want to use Lambda functions, you should use map instead, just because it makes it a little bit clearer without so many brackets what's going on. By the way, if you want to run this code and check the value returned by map, you need to turn it into a list in order to be able to print it out. Just because the map function doesn't return a list of numbers, it will return something called a map object. We're going to learn more about what those things are as we move through these videos, but for now, just turn it into a list if you want to see the values in your console. So just to recap, lambdas are functions without a name. You can give them a name by assigning them to a variable, but they don't have a name in the function definition. They are used to return a value calculated from its parameters, and they're almost never used to perform actions. They're almost always single line, so you don't want to be doing anything really complicated in them. And one of the big reasons why they're single line is because their syntax gets really complicated to read as they get longer. Very often, it's better to define a normal function than a Lambda function in most situations. Lambda functions, I personally don't use them very much because I find them that they are a bit difficult to read and keep track of, especially as your programs grow. And that's it for this video. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.